All right, welcome to today's record review. Today we're going to look at an interesting EEG. Now, this EEG is abnormal, and the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to do a baseline review of this study. So we're just going to scroll through. And what I like to do when I'm first reviewing an EEG is just make sure that my settings are correct. And I'll notice up here that the high filter setting is not set properly. So let's change that to 70 hertz, which is the ACNS recommended setting for your high filter, at least when you're starting out. The default setting, the low filter is okay at 1. And let's go ahead and turn this artifact reduction off so we can see the true EEG without any type of algorithm. Though this can be helpful at times, the artifact reduction, it is not a perfect program. All right, so let's start back at the beginning here. So my thoughts here are that we might be in a drowsy state or even sleep. This looks like a presentation of sleep spindles. So right about here, here to here, maybe right there. And I also think that we have some posts. So I think in the occipital region, the left and right occipital region, I think we have some positive occipital sharp transients of sleep. So let's put this into average reference and see if we see a downward deflection, a prominent positive deflection. And we sure do. It almost looks like a check mark. So there's a great example right there. So you see that the deflection goes below the baseline. That's because posts are inherently positive, or at least the component that we record from the scalp, the prominent component is positive. So indeed, we have some posts here. There's one right there. There's one right there. There's a wonderful one right there, very clearly seen. All right, since we're anticipating sleep, let's go to the best montage for sleep. It looks like we have a rudimentary vertex wave there, as well as there, and you can see these posts in the occipital region. They're doing a positive phase reversal, so they're separating away from each other, the opposite of a negative phase reversal. They're opening up away from each other. There's a nice vertex wave there. And this looks like an arousal starting about right here, maybe right after these sleep spindles. So we have some sleep spindles maybe from here to here, but I do think we have a K complex and then an arousal, and that's typical. And it makes sense logically. A K complex is elicited by some type of stimulus. The classical example is knocking, taking your knuckles and knocking on the desk. But any type of auditory stimulus can evoke a K complex, but also a stimulus that we might not recognize. Maybe the patient, twitched their lip or something that they did that stimulated themselves. Nonetheless, let's go to an average reference and see if we can make more sense of this. See if this is a K complex. So here we're still in sleep, and then perhaps that's a K complex. So you can see as you progress, there's a big negative phase and then a downward phase. So this is probably a K complex, followed by an arousal of diffuse alpha band activity. That arousal, which is a few seconds of alpha band or alpha frequency activity, tends to follow the patient's PDR frequency. All right, we will go back to a double banana montage. And this patient is now awake. We can see the appearance of diffuse EMG artifact. And now we see a nice PDR. See a nice PDR. So let's count this PDR. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and a half. And let's count the next segment. We'll go backwards. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.5. And we have a lot of EMG on the left side, so just temporarily, let's reduce our high filter setting. We can better resolve the PDR. We're just going to make sure that the frequency is synchronous, symmetric. Symmetric with respect to frequency. We know it's synchronous. We want to make sure that the frequencies align, that the left is not slower than the right or vice versa. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.5. Okay, so that, or those are the same across the hemispheres. Good representation of the PDR. Then we see some slowing down here, most likely due to some drowsiness. You can see some more posts. So the posts reemerge. Let's confirm these are posts by putting it in a, let's try a hat band with occipital focus, also called a circumferential hat band montage. And you can see that they're phase reversing in the bioccipital region away from each other. For example, with this wave, it's going up here, but yet it's going down here. And this is I believe this is T501, 01, 02. So those are going to cancel each other out, essentially. That's why there's a relative flatness element to that particular channel. And then we have O2, T6. We can see those right here. So since posts are positive, or they have a prominent positive component, right at this moment in time, right here, whoops, pardon me, right there, there's an upward deflection. If input 1 is more negative with respect to input 2, we see an upward deflection. But actually, O1 is the source of this discharge. So it's generating a positive voltage, a positive current. So it's making T5 negative by association, a relative negative feature to T5. So that's why we have the upward deflection. Notice that over here, O2, so in the right hemisphere, in the right occipital, O2 is connected to T6. And again, the polarity rule states that if input 1 is more negative than input 2, there's an upward deflection. And vice versa, if input 2 is more negative than input 1, there's a downward deflection. So you can see right here, there's a downward deflection, which means that O2 is more positive than T6. And it's actually the source of that activity because posts do have a prominent positive phase. And so you can kind of see how they're opening away from each other. Right, moving on, go back to a anterior to posterior bipolar montage. So it looks like the patient started to sleep again or transitioned into sleep. We can see some rudimentary sleep spindles in this region right here, in this region right here as well. But notice what happens right there, another K complex. And as I said before, with a K complex, you will often see a following arousal. So here's your K complex, which is going to be they're broader and more blunt than a vertex wave. So you have a big negative and then a downward component. Big up, big down, and they are more frontally shifted or anteriorly shifted than vertex waves. So while vertex waves are going to be more in the true vertex or central region, K complexes are shifted towards the eyes, towards the front, just a bit. So they're more frontocentral. And you'll see following the K complex, we have an arousal and the reemergence of the patient's PDR. In this case, we don't see what I was talking about earlier, that diffuse PDR or diffuse alpha. This patient just basically transitions directly to their awake background, and that can happen as well. Okay, and then if we look at the left side right here, right where I have my sweep edge marked, there is a sharp wave discharge. So the difference between sharp waves and spike waves is this. Spike waves are spikier. They have a duration from between 20 to 70 milliseconds, while sharp wave discharges have a duration from between 70 to 200 milliseconds. They're all equally epileptiform. It's just that it's more defining the nuances of their morphology. So it's still within the uh, perimeter of what would be considered an epileptiform discharge. And we can see that this one is left frontotemporal. Now, very important note, F7, the F7 electrode and the F8 electrode, they are actually not over the frontal lobe. They are not representative of frontal activity, so it's kind of a misnomer. They're actually located over the anterior portion of the left and right temporal lobes or temporal tips. So in this particular discharge, we're seeing a sharp wave discharge, which is being recorded from the left anterior temporal region. You can see that it's phase reversing, and F7 and T3 have a more or less equipotential. Maybe F7 has a little bit of a discharge, so um, it's being emitted within the cortex, maybe a little bit closer to F7 than it is T3. And this is interesting. We see an emergence of a left temporal seizure. Now, notice what happens. The PDR over the left temporal region, well, the PDR over the left hemisphere, located primarily in the occipital region, drops out, is disrupted. This seizure basically wipes out the PDR over the left. However, this is a focal seizure, and note that at this time, the PDR, or posterior dominant rhythm, over the right occipital region is undisturbed. The affected seizure tissue has not encroached upon this region, so it is still humming along. And this could be sort of a cheap WADA test, a poor man's WADA test. And I say that because if a person's memory in language, let's say, is hypothetically on the left side of their brain, then with such activity here, we would expect them to not be able to remember much during this paroxysm. We would also expect them to have expressive aphasia. So if the patient was able to talk, converse, uh, and recall objects during such a seizure as we see here, we could infer that their dominant hemisphere is over the right because they were still able to function within those parameters. Now, as the seizure progresses, we see evolution, and more specifically, we see a morphological transition, a change. It kind of grows, it evolves. So there's an amplitude increase, first of all. We also see a decrease in frequency. So we start, well, really, the seizure, you could make the argument, perhaps, at least from surface EEG, starts with this sharp wave discharge and this sharp wave discharge. And then immediately after that, we see this rhythmic 4 hertz activity. But as the seizure progresses, we see it slows down uh, a bit. to maybe 3.5 hertz. So you could fit maybe 3.5 of these sharp waves within a second. We also see the increase in amplitude, and we also see more slowing. So as this seizure continues to evolve and and uh, and fire, you see the amplitude increases, and you also see the frequency slows to really at this point it's around 3 hertz. It's still rhythmic. It's very gradual change. And also notice that around here, the right side, the right temporal region becomes affected, or perhaps before that, but we're going to sort of arbitrarily pick this moment in time. And so watch what happens to the PDR over the right side. Now that PDR is going to be disrupted, more proof beyond the obvious that the activity is rhythmic and epileptiform. You can also see the PDR drop out. So now we have bitemporal participation. Since the voltage is so relatively high, it's certainly okay to trim your sensitivity. You want to be able, I'm going to back up a page. You want to be able to make out the individual waveforms. We're moving along. Now notice what happens in the single lead EKG. Look what happens in the ECG channel. We actually see asystole. We see the heart rate stop. So from this point, this is the last beat that we'll see for a while. There is no heartbeat. And while we're considering that, let's also take into account, remember I changed the sensitivity to 15 microvolts per millimeter, but you can see this rhythmicity. It's around 3.75 or 4 hertz in the right temporal chain. In the left temporal chain, you can start to see it slowing down, right? So let's turn that artifact reduction on for a minute. I'm going to change the sensitivity. And so this artifact reduction is just an algorithm that Persist created to almost excise just the EMG artifact. And the idea is it does not affect any authentic cortical activities such as spikes, which are around the same frequency. EMG artifact is around 50 hertz. Well, spikes can also be around 50 hertz. Spikes are from 20 to 70 milliseconds. A 20 millisecond spike, if you convert 20 milliseconds to seconds, 0.02, take the reciprocal, you get 50 hertz. All right, but we can see over the left temporal chain that it slows down into this rhythmic delta type of pattern here. We see it's a little bit faster to the right. However, maybe about right here, we can see that there's some synchronicity between hemispheres. And although there is a difference, say right here between the left and right temporal chain, and right here between the left and right temporal chain, we do see that there starts to be some synchronicity between the left and the right, primarily the left and the right temporal regions. And you have some field propagation to the left and right parasagittal as well as frontal midline region. Notice that ECG is still flat. Now, the ictal pattern transitions to GPDs, it transitions to periodic discharges at, say, 1.5 hertz, perhaps. And then that periodicity slows down, maybe to 0.3, 0.3 hertz. And then we see there's this post-ictal suppression. So the brain, the cortex, is just exhausted. So it's going to take a few minutes it's going to take a moment to reset. Notice that the heart rate starts back right here. So there's quite a while without the heart pumping blood. So we had cerebral hypoperfusion, hypo meaning less or lower than something should be, not hyper, but hypoperfusion. So you'll see a dropout of faster frequencies. That is the first frequency band to go when there is a loss of blood flow, say from an anoxic event or a stroke, you'll see the fast frequencies disappear first. And this kind of mirrors sedation too. With sedation, you see the fast frequencies drop out first. Now, why couldn't we call this burst suppression? Well, burst suppression can be seen with deepening levels of sedation as well as cerebral hyperperfusion. But this is such a quick, abrupt transition to periodic discharges, is my theory why this is not burst suppression. And in addition, burst suppression needs to have more than 3 phases. So here we have almost like a triphasic morphology. We have an up negative phase, a down second phase, and then a third negative phase. 1, 2, 3. So these are best characterized as generalized periodic discharges. That we have maybe 5 seconds of generalized suppression. And we can see around here, since the heart rate has been restored, it is self-corrected, it's come back online. We can see some of the brain waves coming back. We can see that some theta is coming back, and then the faster frequencies start to represent. And this is a little complicated because how much blame do you assign to the seizure itself, and how much blame do you assign to the heart not pumping? So it's likely a combination of those two. All right, so now let's just go through a bit more, and we'll see that there's generalized delta. We'll take off the artifact reduction. We have this generalized delta slowing. So this is an encephalopathic pattern, most likely due to, like we talked about, a combination of that transient cerebral hypoperfusion from the asystole as well as the post-ictal effects. But we do see a PDR right here, so that's good news for the patient. See a PDR 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's in their range, in the range that it was preceding the seizure. And then the this clip ends. So now what I'd like to do is show you how this seizure looks within quantitative EEG, within the trends. And we will do a split screen, and we'll back up to the beginning of the seizure here. So the time base is 15 minutes within the trends. So from here, from right there to there is 15 minutes. Okay. So the seizure more or less starts in this region. Remember, we had these 2 sentinel sharp wave discharges over the left frontotemporal region. Okay, so what we are seeing right about here at the beginning of the seizure within the FFT spectrogram is we're seeing increased activity within the delta range where it's kind of white hot. So your x-axis is simply time. Your y-axis is going to be the spectrum of all of the frequencies that we expect to see on surface EEG that can be recorded with surface EEG. And similar to a Doppler radar, we have colors that indicate different intensities. So black is pretty much no activity. So if you had a patient that you were recording who was unfortunately electrocerebrally silent, then you would just see black across all of the frequencies across time. There's a little bit of activity at this dark blue, and then a little bit more with teal, kind of lime green. That's like moderate activity. Yellow is starting to get high, red, pink, so on and so forth. So it's white hot right here over the left. And you can see that there is a downward slope as the seizure progresses. And this makes sense because seizures oftentimes are associated with deceleration, acceleration, as well as deceleration. And I'm talking about this right there, that white oval. And notice how over time, there's kind of this downward slope, and that's the seizure essentially slowing down. Here is the PDR after the seizure has ended, reemerging. That's the PDR reemerging right there. Also, within the rhythmicity spectrogram, which is a proprietary trend, you have your your x-axis representing simply time, and your y-axis representing that spectrum of frequencies that can be recorded with surface EEG. And wherever there's a shading, a heavier darkening, or coloring that's more heavily shaded, that indicates there's rhythmicity at that particular frequency. So you can see, well, let's see, that's 10 is about there at 10 hertz. So that's maybe 4 hertz. If this is 2 hertz here, so it's really rhythmic right here. And then it starts to slope down, and that's just it actually splits. There's some activity that speeds up, which is okay. There's different frequency bands or layers a lot of times with EEG, and then it also slopes down. Within the asymmetry spectrogram, this is showing you again the x-axis is time, is simply time, while the y-axis is once again, as with the previous two trends, just showing you the spectrum of frequencies that you would expect to record with surface EEG. So that's anywhere from 1 hertz to 30 hertz. At any moment in time, say, for example, right here, what this particular asymmetry trend is showing you is if you see a particular color, say blue, which is representative of the left hemisphere, at those particular frequencies, so maybe from 1 to 4 hertz, the left hemisphere is more involved. There's an asymmetry. You can see that's really the seizure right there. It kind of sticks out from everything else. If we change our time base and zoom in a bit and just say do 10 minutes of horizontal expanse, we can see the seizure evolve. We also have two asymmetry trends which are stacked on top of each other here. We have an amplitude trend. You can see the amplitude grows or increases and then decreases with the seizure. And then we have this post-ictal suppression. The peak envelope basically mirrors the amplitude, well, for lack of a better word, the amplitude EEG trend kind of mirrors that pattern. You can see it increases. Look how the left decouples from the right. It's because the left is a focal seizure. So you see here within the peak envelope trend, the red and the blue are essentially in line, but right about here, the blue separates. It's a little bit higher. That's because it's decoupled because it's the chief participant with the seizure. Of course, then the right side does jump in after a bit of time. You'll see that the heart rate is humming along here, and then boom, it just drops out. Well, if we look at the EEG, the last beat is right there. So there's a little bit of a lag on the trend, but it drops out right here. And you can see, and for some reason, the FFT spectrum over the left is not representing this really well, perhaps because of artifact. But notice how over the right hemisphere within the FFT spectrogram, that it's essentially black, very dark blue across all the frequencies. So that's just showing you generalized suppression during that time. We could try a suppression ratio trend set. You could see that about here, the suppression ratio actually increases. It's becoming more suppressed. That's due to the seizure. But in a nutshell, this is a great example of a focal left temporal seizure with spread or propagation to the right temporal region and ictal asystole. There are informed theories which link such an asystole during a seizure to SUDEP, sudden unexplained death in epilepsy patients. All right, that is all we have today for our record review. Thank you very much for participating and joining. I hope you have a nice rest of your day.